Reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity, this is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you as always. Hop on in here and let's talk about gender diversity some more. Whoa, it's 2024 y'all. Happy New Year. Hope you are doing well. And this week, much like we do every time we come together, we take a look at a comment from a public figure or politician or somebody else who just likes talking about gender diversity. And we take their often confident declarations for the questions we hope they were intended to be. And we look to the literature to see if we can't find a scientific consensus around an answer. Now, this week, I have something a little bit different. This week we have the inimitable Elliot Page, Canadian actor, a man who's received various accolades, including nominations for an Academy Awards, 2 BAFTA Awards, and a Primetime Emmy, of course, just in his spare time. Elliot Page, a trans guy, maybe one of the most famous trans guys in the world, certainly in Hollywood. And something of a legend, really. And Elliot has been talking about gender diversity in a few different forums, and I, generally speaking, am pretty happy to see it. Like, it's great to see trans people just being out and proud and themselves and carving paths for other trans people to follow in the future, perhaps. And it's awesome. So here is Elliot Page talking about gender diversity. So here is Canadian actor Elliot Page.
I was able to finally make the steps and the decision to be myself and to do what I wanted to do and knew I needed to do to live fully. And I'm feeling that joy every day. What it has allowed me is what feels like truly being alive for the first time.
Many thanks to Elliot Page for such a genuinely interesting question, posed as they often aren't, in the form of humility and reflection. And hey, we'll take it for the question we know it is intended to be. Is it possible for trans people to experience what Elliot Page is describing? I mean, clearly it is, but is it possible? Is this something that trans people experience on the whole? This kind of, being alive, feeling alive for the first time. Now, this speaks to a concept known as gender euphoria. Now, you might have come across the term gender dysphoria in the past. Certainly, we've talked about gender dysphoria, which is quite a discrete experience. Abigail Thorne has this really interesting take on gender dysphoria, by the by. Abigail Thorne talks about gender dysphoria being something that's kind of a consequence of social challenges faced by trans people, and that in a perfect world, trans people wouldn't feel dysphoric. And I quite like that. In the medical literature, we consider gender dysphoria to be that kind of tearing incongruence between somebody's biological configuration and their gender identity. But maybe that is something of an old idea now. Now, gender euphoria, on the other hand, is not it's not a single spectrum between gender dysphoria and gender euphoria, and they're not mutually exclusive. But gender euphoria is that sort of, it's quite difficult to define, if I'm honest, but it is essentially a kind of, I'd say Austin and colleagues in 2022, they gave a pretty good definition. Gender euphoria, their study was called A Grounded Theory Exploration of Experiencing Gender Affirmation in Psychology and Sexuality. They say that gender euphoria is a concept that's emerged from within the transgender community to rectify a one-sided narrative that transgender individuals' lives are focused exclusively on experience of gender dysphoria and bodily distress. To date, there's no single consistent definition of gender euphoria, but the term is generally used to refer to a range of positive feelings, including but not limited to comfort, confidence, certainty, satisfaction, and joy. in response to the affirmation of one's body or one's gender identity. Now, full disclosure, I've experienced what I think is a bit of gender euphoria in the past. It's a kind of lifting of spirits that's beautiful to behold, honestly. I experienced it when I had this stupid little hat on. I've told you the story before, my little zip-up jumper thing. And for the first time, I saw myself in the mirror and kind of categorized girl instead of boy for the first time, just for a split second. And I just burst into tears because, that weight that was on my shoulders was suddenly lifted. And it's a wonderful, wonderful experience. So I looked to the literature. We looked to the literature to kind of see what are the experiences of gender euphoria that people have. Is it something that people experience? Are there commonalities? What is gender euphoria and how do people experience it? And I read 17 different studies in the field, a few of which were absolute corkers, really cool studies, a lot of which weren't really targeting gender euphoria in the way that I would describe it. It's more like happiness or something, and what leads to happiness for the trans community, which is a slightly different question. But there were, we're going to go through about 6 or 7 studies, which I think were really good, but there were 3 that were absolutely gorgeous that I'm going to focus on. One of them's by Austin and colleagues, which was published last year. One of them is by Bechel and colleagues, published the year before, which was stunning. One of my all-time favorites and a real seminal piece of work in the field. But I gotta say that my absolute favorite has been from Mann and colleagues, published this year, not this year, 2023, last year, called Thriving Not Surviving. And it's about school experiences of euphoria, asking about what school experiences can facilitate euphoria in children and young people. Stunning piece of work. I really, really liked it. And we'll finish on that one. But we're going to start with something, one of the studies, again, Austin and colleagues, 2022. This is another one of my all-time favorites. They used a photo elicitation model. So they asked participants to upload 5 to 10 photos to a survey, essentially asking people to upload photos that described or represented any and all of the following. So physical and emotional aspects of your experiences with gender dysphoria, the ways in which your gender dysphoria impacts your life, ways in which you have tried to cope with gender dysphoria, and importantly for this part of the study, for this particular study, experiences that have minimized or eliminated your dysphoria. So it's obviously has this kind of dysphoria focus in the actual photo elicitation, but they then interviewed people using those photos, and they had a conversation about them, and they started to talk about gender euphoria more explicitly. Now, this becomes really interesting because oh my goodness, the results of this piece of research. Listen, if you only have the chance to read one study today, this is the study to go and see, because I have not seen many people do such a very good job of eliciting information from people. I mean, that sounds like a little bit cold. What I mean is that these are personal experiences. They are difficult to talk about, and it's very sensitive, and I know this. I was at my physio this morning, my physiotherapist. I went to go and see her for the first time. It's being funded by a charity mostly, which is wonderful. And I went to go and see her, and I felt like a child. I was in the space with her as a transgender woman. There's not been an opportunity to talk about the fact that I'm transgender, really, and I know that I'm going to have to break that ground, and I don't know what her reaction is going to be, whether it's going to be welcoming or whether, because we're in a kind of intimate experience, right? Like, she's mobilizing my arms and legs to see how strong I am and stuff, and it is a bit intimate, and I want to kind of tell her I'm trans, and I did, but I was like so scared. I felt very kind of like adolescent in this kind of, I don't know if I'm going to be rejected kind of, it's weird. So I feel for, and I'm a freaking researcher. I do this for a freaking living, and I'm still, sensitive on the other side of things when I'm being interviewed or being consulted, So I feel for researchers in this field, talking to people about their very sensitive experiences. And yet these researchers have clearly done that very well using photo elicitation and by creating contexts in which people genuinely feel safe. And that's really, really, really good. So what did they find? So they had 30 participants. And they also, listen, they did a really clever thing with asking people about their gender. So usually we'll ask people what their gender assigned at birth was and what their gender identity is, and give people the opportunity to kind of type in or write in what their gender identity is, given that it could be a number of different things. But these guys, they created a big list of different gender identities: trans man, trans woman, non-binary, queer or genderqueer, agender, two-spirit, man, woman, or other, giving people the opportunity to type in. And they asked 2 questions about gender identity. They said, gender identities, select all the labels that fit for you. And then primary gender identity, select one gender identity label that best fits you. So they asked both questions. They gave people a real opportunity to kind of really explore their gender identity in this little space. Very cool. So what were people's experiences of gender euphoria like in response, of course, to the question from the amazing Elliot Page? Well, it's exhilarating, really. Direct quotation from participants. There's going to be lots of direct quotations from participants in here. It's an interesting part of the transgender experience because, you know, on one end you have dysphoria, like gender dysphoria, but you also have gender euphoria when you get that like actualization of how you actually feel and it matches your presentation and just your physicalness. It creates this just wonderful aspect of gender recognition and you feel complete and whole. And, you know, you see your image in the mirror and it's just wonderful. It's not like, oh gosh, or, you know, how can I make myself look more like this? Or why can't I make myself look more like this? And you know, it's just like, this is how I see myself and how everyone else sees me. And it's like, it's a gender euphoria. That's a 46-year-old white transgender woman. This is my first time going out wearing bikini top. Which, holy crap, was it scary, but holy crap, was it amazing. Like, this is a really big win for me. And this is out on the beach in California, just having a good time. And I just felt incredibly affirmed by this experience. A 23-year-old white transgender woman. Sometimes it's just sitting around the house and cuddling and, you know, just taking on that feminine role and wearing sweatpants and pajamas and, you know, like letting go of the presentational aspects of gender and just realizing the emotional aspects of gender. It's a 46-year-old transgender woman. I'm pretty much always correctly gendered in public, but every time, you know, I'll get called miss or ma'am or she or her, I get giddy and bubbly about it. I found that being correctly gendered using she or her pronouns is one of the biggest sources of my gender euphoria because it signifies that people are seeing the correct gender in me, especially just based on first glance. Okay, so this picture I really love. So this is a picture of me and my dog Rocky. And we were at an event for my girlfriend who was graduating college at the time. And the reason I chose this was because I was in a queer space, so like I already felt comfortable, but hadn't really dressed in like a masculine way for like a fancy event ever. So like though it's really casual, like I'm in black jeans and a button-down white shirt, like it just felt really empowering to be able to like wear what I wanted in an event that I knew was fancy with my partner in like our queer relationship with like our son Rocky. So like it just felt like a cool experience to be able to wear what I wanted and think we all felt good in what we were wearing and how we were presenting, and we were in a space that was safe, and so that was a good thing. 26-year-old Latinx non-binary individual. If I'm wearing something cute and I'm out in public, it'll last all day long, or, you know, depending on what I'm doing, it could last a couple of days. It definitely shows in the way I carry myself. You know, in that outfit, I float around. It's just I don't just walk from one place to the other. I kind of float around and feel like I'm into some, you know, euphoric high. That could last all day. 46-year-old transgender woman. I was standing with my shirt off in front of the mirror in our house and looked down and saw the hair on my chest and was like, oh, this is coming off. And now I started shaving, and at the end of it, I looked down and was like, I was seeing myself for the first time. It was incredible, like the wave of euphoria that shot over me, and I just started bawling. 34-year-old white transgender woman. The final quote. We're just going to keep quoting, guys. These are just stunning. There's no better way to explore what people experience of gender euphoria than to hear them directly, right? I thought of this picture specifically in the context of your question of like what made dysphoria better or more resolved. I went through getting top surgery and I had to wait a year, and then it took a year or two to get and finish my chest piece. And I know that that was something that I really wanted, and that would make me feel like I could own. And another thing where I could embody myself. And for me, tattoos have always been a really important way of being able to adorn myself and choose how I look and like how I express myself. And so being able to get such like a large, beautiful piece of art just felt really great. And so I look at this picture and I'm like, this is what I worked so hard for as a young person. And it just felt so good to be able to say like, this is me and this is how I want to look. And this is how I wanted to look for such a long time. And now I made it happen. I've been able to manifest that in who I am. A 31-year-old white transgender man. Fascinating work to my mind. And one of the interesting things was that of all the 30 participants that these interviewers interviewed, they found this consistent finding that gender affirmation looked to be a requisite precursor, in their words. It looked to be necessary, that people needed to feel affirmed in their gender in order to experience gender euphoria. So they're kind of images and verbal narratives that people shared that minimize their gender dysphoria. They consistently and unequivocally illustrated gender affirming experiences, in the author's own words. Fascinating stuff. Now, from Bechal next, Galvan and Van Anders in 2021. Again, listen, you know we like a good title on this podcast, but a little shiny gender breakthrough. Community Understandings of Gender Euphoria in the International Journal of Transgender Health. You know, you're gonna love that journal. The final sample that they included had 47 participants in, mean age, again, 26.6 years, so a little younger than the previous sample, which I think was in the high 30s. 26.6 years mean age, ranged from 18 to 56. 52 participants originally consented to be part of the study, but they ended up with 47 final participants who were being interviewed. Participants in the study were 85% white, 4% African American, and 11% were other races and ethnicities, including Ashkenazi, East Asian, Mexican American, multiracial, and South Asian. Participants self-identified their sexual orientation and identity, 28% queer, 21% gay or lesbian, 15% bisexual, 13% asexual, 9% heterosexual, 6% pan, 4% demi, and 2% questioning. 26% were cis women, 26% were trans guys, and 26% were non-binary or genderqueer, 9% trans women, 4% agender, 4% women, 2% cis men, and 2% non-binary men. So the majority of these participants were cis women, trans men, and non-binary folk. Interesting interesting group of folk to be in there. But they basically asked them about their experiences of gender euphoria. And this is what they said. They described it as a breath of fresh air, trans celebration, happiness, wonder, hope, a moment of elation or connection with one's gender, sheer joy and contentment, and a shiny little gender breakthrough. The first time I remember feeling gender euphoria is when I tried on my friend's binder. I'd been kind of questioning my gender, but I wasn't positive. I put that on and looked down and couldn't see my chest at all. I was flat. I looked in the mirror and just looked right. I felt a rush go through my body and I burst into laughter and a huge smile and began running my hands across my chest. I ran to my friend who was excitedly jumping and exclaiming, "Look how flat I am, look!" And I have a huge, goofy grin on my face. Gender fluid demigirl, 21 years of age. It's literally life-saving. I wish I could describe it to those of you who hadn't had it before, but existing in a space in a moment where your body and gender align and feel right with each other when so often that is not the case is electric. It's what keeps trans folks alive. Those moments of being fully and euphorically ourselves, a non-binary person of 21 years of age. When I went to look in the mirror, I saw that a body shaper had given me very visible breasts. I had shaved my face, chest and arms just before, and not only that feeling, but also seeing myself with bare skin and with breasts, I knew in that moment that that is how I always wanted to feel and how I always wanted to look. That realization was both affirming and terrifying. I felt great because in that moment I knew for sure I was trans, but I also felt deeply upset and scared because in that moment I knew for sure I was trans. I sank to my bathroom floor and cried. Trans woman of 24 years of age. I have a haircut where I can transition easily from femme hair down to a masculine man bun look. This is super great because if my gender feeling shifts during the day, I can experience the feeling of gender euphoria easily by changing the way I'm wearing my hair. I know when I walk in and see my reflection and either think, wow, yeah, or wait, that's not right, and I'll shift. A gender fluid demigirl, 21 years of age. I don't believe that my gender has to be consumable or digestible by others for it to be valid. In fact, I experience the most comfort and euphoria when I know other people will never be able to label, consume, or insert their gaze into my gender because that act of defining belongs solely to me, non-binary person of 23 years of age. When I stepped out of the stall and saw myself in the mirror, I was almost moved to tears. I have no other good way to describe it, but I saw myself back. I could look at my reflection and I could think, this is me. In that moment, I had gained more self-confidence than I could remember having. Even my friends saw a difference in my overall disposition. That's from a cisgender woman of 23 years of age. This is where things are kind of interesting, right? Because I wonder if you, even yourselves, even if you aren't trans or non-binary or gender fluid or gender diverse, whether you've ever had an experience of like feeling like you embodied your gender more wholly in some way, either because you found an outfit that suddenly made you feel more feminine or more masculine, or because you are building muscle and you're seeing the muscles grow in the mirror, you know, those moments, or whether you're growing in stubble and, you know, you shave it right and it looks like really manly. Like those moments of gender euphoria where things line up, I don't think are unique to the gender diverse population. I think it's something we can all experience. It's just rarer and more precious for the trans and gender diverse populations because it happens so rarely for us. Next up, we have Skelton and colleagues. Skelton Riggs, Pullen Sansfathon. Yes, that Pullen Sansfathon. Cat's Wise, also another author I see a lot of. Aurora and Thibault. From 2023, it just feels really nice when people call me by my name. Accounts of gender euphoria among Australian trans young people and their parents from the Journal of Gender Studies. They brought together a total of 12 families, so 12 trans young people and 16 of their parents. For 4 of the young people, both of their parents participated. The young people's ages range from 9 to 14 years, and they reported their gender as female, gender fluid, male, agender, non-binary, supergender, or neutral. I gotta say, I've come across a lot of neo pronouns and new ways of talking and thinking about gender. I've not come across supergender before. I think supergender sounds awesome. And their parents' ages range from 33 to 51 years of age, reporting their gender as female, male, or non-binary. Most of the participants were white. All of the parents describe themselves as white, but of the young people, a couple of the young people reported themselves as identifying as a member of an ethnic minority. And of course, not all of them have both parents there. So that does make sense, even though it sounds counterintuitive. So the authors came up with 3 different themes sort of sources or locales of gender euphoria, maybe kind of sources of gender euphoria. And then they had a bunch of quotes, really cool. And they're all conversations between young people and their parents. So once again, just stunning, really good opportunity to get an insight into people's lives. The first theme was, I'm glad I am trans. Euphoria as a product of self-understanding. Melody. Actually, to be honest, from my point of view, as soon as Imogen got to the point where she chose her name and we changed her room and we put Imogen on the door and we did all the things that we chucked out all your boy clothes. Imogen got made better clothes. Melody got girls' clothes that you wanted and you chose your bedspread and all that stuff that you do to socially transition. I saw and think people around us saw a huge change in Imogen's happiness and contentment in life. So I think she'd been a fairly unhappy little possum before that, and there was a big swing up in happiness, and that's probably continued. Imogen. Yeah, I'm pretty happy now. The second theme, they just act like they normally do as a boy. Euphoria as a product of close interpersonal relationships. Aubrey. A couple of weeks after coming out, I cut my hair short and people are like, wow, Brady, who's Aubrey's father. It's not a very big school, so most of the kids know most of the kids, Aubrey. And I was really happy because the day I came to school with my haircut, a couple of my friends ran up and gave me a big hug and it was nice. The interviewer, what are some things that make you feel really good or happy? Aubrey, it just feels really nice when people call me by my name. I like it. Aubrey. And the last theme from this study, whenever random people use my correct name, euphoria as a product of interactions in the broader community. Interviewer, what are some things that make you feel happy or really good? Mason, they're not gendered terms, but people calling me mate or buddy, especially old, with the bus drivers, they're always old, dying men with grey hair. And I'm like, thank you. And they're like, no problem, mate. And yeah, that's nice. And people using the correct pronouns. I guess I'm more used to it now, but it feels good. Morgan, what about that pride stuff? Jackson, yeah. Morgan, we do a lot of organising pride stuff and going to pride festivals, which Jackson always says, I think he said to me a few times, like, they feel they can breathe a bit easier, when they're in a community. The authors basically identified that there are different sources of gender euphoria, and they describe gender euphoria as this sense of acceptance, achievement, affirmation, alignment, authenticity, comfort, congruence, ease, joy, relief, satisfaction, and validation. And that there are different sources of this. And I found that in the wider literature too, this kind of euphoria isn't just a kind of personal experience of things lining up. It's also about connection with the wider community, about close interpersonal relationships with people who are affirming your experience, as well as, of course, that internal experience of things lining up too. Now we're getting towards a good definition of this kind of gender euphoria, as wide and broad as it is, and the various different sources through which people can experience it. It actually also has good, strong outcomes associated with it. Reisner and colleagues in 2023, last year, I can't believe 2023 is last year. What happened? 2023, last year, exploring gender euphoria in a sample of transgender and gender diverse patients at 2 US urban community health centers in psychiatry research. They did this really big survey, just over 2,000 people in the sample, most of them mean age about 28, and there are a good diverse range of folk in the sample. About 70% were white, about 3% were Asian, 5% just shy of that identified as black, 5.5% as Latinx or Hispanic, and 14.6% as multiracial. And around 40% were trans men, about 30% were trans women, and around 24% were non-binary folks assigned female at birth, and about 6% were non-binary folks assigned male at birth. So the authors were interested in predicting gender euphoria, and they did something quite interesting. They treated gender euphoria as a binary. So they split the data on high gender euphoria versus low gender euphoria, treated that as a binary output variable, and then conducted a multivariate logistic regression, predicting, what predicted high versus low gender euphoria of all the variables that they were measuring. And they found a couple of interesting things. So they found that high gender euphoria was associated with a statistically significantly lower odds of gender dysphoria. Now, bearing in mind that gender euphoria and gender dysphoria, of course, aren't mutually exclusive, and it's probably not helpful to think of them as different ends of a single continuum. But it is interesting that people with high gender euphoria were less likely to experience gender dysphoria. They had a lower odds of alcohol misuse, a higher odds of resilience, really interestingly. And while gender euphoria was not statistically significantly associated with psychological distress, it was in the direction that was expected. So high gender euphoria was associated with lower odds of psychological distress. It just wasn't quite statistically significant. They also found some other stuff. They found that dysphoria was associated with an increased odds of psychological distress, reduced odds of resilience. Super interesting. Essentially what we find here is that gender euphoria has the potential to be a protective factor that improves resilience, that reduces the chance of experiencing alcohol misuse, and reduces the odds of experiencing gender dysphoria. So gender euphoria might be, given its connection with resilience here, it's very early days. You got to bear in mind, out of all of this literature, we've done this a couple of times recently where we've stepped into the kind of very modern literature, and it ends up being very qualitative because it's really exploratory of a new concept. And this is one of the first published sort of larger scale quant kind of studies. Certainly there's not enough research in this field to do a meta-analysis or anything. And I do love a good meta-analysis. So, a bit of a shame in a way, but it gives us a sort of, it's all very, very exploratory and a little bit speculative, but maybe there's the opportunity here for gender euphoria to present something of a protective factor, maybe a sort of factor connected to resilience. Not quite sure yet, but it looks like that might be the case. Now, finally, let's talk about Mann and colleagues, 2023. So Mann and colleagues were really interested in students, staff, and parents' perspectives of experiencing gender euphoria, basically, of schools as places in which euphoria can occur, sites of euphoria, as they describe it. Their study is called Thriving, Not Surviving. Okay, I just love a good title. LGBTQ plus students, staff, and parents' experiences of schools as sites of euphoria in Sexuality Research and Social Policy, a journal of the NSRC. This is kind of cool. So they gathered this perspective of a huge number of students, 706 students, 107 staff, and 57 parents in Australian schools, and asked them about experiences of euphoria, essentially gender euphoria. And particularly focused within the student cohort, because there's so many of them. And because the student cohort had such a high number of gender diverse participants compared to cisgender participants, they weren't excluding people. They said, cisgender participants included too. But they were both sexually and gender diverse and cisgender and heterosexual. So, it had a huge number of participants in here talking about gender euphoria. And so they asked them about their experiences. And this is where things, I think, get really, really interesting, because we can talk about what are the school experiences that promote gender euphoria, particularly for these young people. I told my drama teacher I was trans over email, and the next lesson she immediately started referring to me as my chosen name and was super supportive. It felt amazing to be addressed by someone of authority as who I believe I am. That's Walker, a bisexual trans guy, 15 years of age in a public school. During the event Wear It Purple Day, my school put in a lot of effort, like cupcake stalls, decorations, and even a flash mob by the dance class. It made me feel comfortable and proud, even though I'm still in the closet. That's Veronica, a pansexual cis female, 17 years of age in a public school. My school did a special Pride Day and allowed the students to wear rainbow colours to show support of LGBTQ+ students. This made me feel incredibly happy, and I was moved emotionally. That's Sophie, a bisexual cis female, 26 to 35 years of age, in a public school. I've never really said it in conversation before, but it felt so good to be able to feel comfortable enough with myself to actually say it out loud. That's Dakota, a lesbian non-binary person, 16 years of age, at a religious private school. And then this last quote moved me quite a bit. One time in class, we were naming this stuffed animal for philosophy to throw around and take turns with, and once we decided a name, the teacher asked what the toy's pronouns were. Now the toy uses he/they, and it made me pretty sure that if I was ever to tell the teacher my pronouns, it would be okay. That was Alpha, a bisexual non-binary person, 14 years of age, in public school. So narrowing in on a response to Elliot Page, I think we can say you're not alone, Elliot. I hope you don't feel alone, because you certainly are not alone. That experience of euphoria where you feel alive for the first time is an experience that's shared not only by the gender diverse community at large, but maybe even by everyone. But for the gender diverse community, it's such a precious and rare experience that it shines like diamonds. And we, as a community, it's so often, the experience of gender dysphoria is like the front and center of conversations about gender diverse folk, right? So often we have the conversation that, this is going to be a difficult road ahead, for the gender diverse community, it's hard. And people who come out, their parents have that moment, I'm sure, of like, it's going to be a difficult road for them, knowing what the world is like, knowing what the UK is like, knowing what America and countless other places around the world are like. And particularly now, where we see this kind of slight contraction in trans rights worldwide, we can see, people emphasizing the negative aspects of being trans, the dysphoria and the distress. But actually, the experience of being trans can also clearly be one of liberation and beauty and authenticity. And, people like Elliot Page standing out there and carving out a world where we can all be our authentic selves, and where more young people and more people generally can see themselves in the world and can actually maybe take steps to embody themselves more in whatever way that looks like for them. Maybe more and more people can experience the beauty of being their authentic selves in the world, the gender euphoria that comes from being out and ourselves, and finding a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thank you so very much for joining me. You know what? You are extremely welcome here, and it is wonderful, as always, to see you. And I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.